On the night of April 18, 1775, British soldiers marched from Boston to seize rebel weapons but a single rider, Paul Revere, galloped through the night shouting, "The British are coming!" At dawn, in the small town of Lexington, a line of colonial farmers stood facing the king's soldiers. The story of America did not begin with glory, nor with peace. It began with discontent, a restless spirit among the colonies that refused to bow forever to a distant crown. In the mid-18th century, the 30 American colonies thrived under British rule. Yet beneath the surface, the fire of frustration was building. For generations, colonists had built homes, farms, and towns across the vast Atlantic wilderness. They fought their own wars, traded their own goods, and dreamed their own dreams. But their fate was still decided in London. Every new law, every new tax, every royal decree reminded them that they were subjects, not citizens. Then came the spark. In 1765, the Stamp Act demanded taxes on paper goods, from newspapers to legal documents. It wasn't just about money, it was about dignity. No taxation without representation. The phrase echoed in taverns, churches, and meeting halls. To many, it meant, we are Americans. We deserve a voice. Britain, burdened by the cost of empire after the 7 Years' War, ignored the warning signs. It needed revenue and believed the colonies must pay their share. To Parliament, the colonies were assets. To the colonists, they were communities with their own souls. As more acts followed, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, resentment deepened. Each British attempt to tighten control only pushed the colonies further apart. Then, in 1773, Boston erupted. When the Boston Tea Party struck, it was more than an act of protest. It was a message. Men disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded ships in the dead of night and hurled crates of tea into the harbor. The sea turned black with rebellion. London was furious. King George III called it treason. The punishment came swiftly. The intolerable acts. Boston's port was closed. Troops patrolled the streets. Rights were stripped away. But instead of fear, the colonies found unity. For the first time, they began to see themselves not as scattered provinces, but as one people standing against tyranny. In 1774, representatives gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Men like John Adams, George Washington, Patrick Henry, and Samuel Adams debated not only taxes, but freedom itself. Could they, farmers and merchants, challenge the greatest empire in the world? Patrick Henry rose and thundered the words that still echo through history. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty, or give me death. The colonies began to prepare. Militias trained quietly, stockpiling weapons. The British Crown saw it as sedition. The Americans saw it as the old world and the new were on a collision course. On the night of April 18, 1775, British soldiers marched from Boston to seize rebel weapons but a single rider, Paul Revere, galloped through the night shouting, "The British are coming!" At dawn, in the small town of Lexington, a line of colonial farmers stood facing the king's soldiers. Muskets trembled in their hands. No one knows who fired the first shot, but that single crack of gunfire became the shot heard round the world. When the smoke cleared, the world had changed. The American Revolution had begun. The news spread like wildfire. Villages and towns rose in defiance. Men left their plows, their families, their peace, to fight for an idea that all men have a right to liberty. In the early months, the war was chaos, an untrained army facing one of the strongest military forces on earth. But among them stood a tall Virginian with calm strength and unshakable purpose. George Washington. Appointed commander-in-chief, he accepted the burden of leading a revolution with little more than faith and courage. While Washington trained his army, the British fortified their power in Boston. In June 1775, the hills outside the city erupted in battle. The Battle of Bunker Hill became a symbol of the colonists' resolve. The Americans lost the hill, but they proved they could stand against the Red. The price of victory for Britain was steep, over 1,000 casualties. A farmer's army had drawn blood from an empire. As the summer of 1775 unfolded, the colonies were torn between loyalty and independence. Some still hoped for peace, a reconciliation with the crown. But the war had already written its truth. Blood once spilled cannot be recalled. The Second Continental Congress met once more. Pamphlets like Thomas Paine's Common Sense spread across the colonies, igniting hearts with the idea that kings were not divine and freedom was not treason. Paine wrote, "The cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind." The words became a spark that turned into wildfire. By 1776, the colonies had reached a point of no return. They no longer begged for representation. They demanded independence. In July of that year, under the flickering candles of Independence Hall, Thomas Jefferson penned the words that would forever define a nation. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The Declaration of Independence was not merely a document, it was a declaration of war, a promise that liberty would be bought with blood, if necessary. As the ink dried, church bells rang and cannons roared in celebration. The colonies had proclaimed themselves the United States of America, but the joy was short-lived. Across the Atlantic, King George prepared his armies for total war. The empire would not let go easily. The stage was set for one of the most defining struggles in human history, a war that would decide not just the fate of America, but the future of freedom itself. And so began the Old War, the fire that would forge a nation. The year was 1776. The birth of a nation was proclaimed, but the child was born in the midst of chaos and surrounded by enemies. While the words of independence rang proudly in Philadelphia, far to the north, the British were already preparing to crush the rebellion once and for all. King George III dispatched the largest expeditionary force the Atlantic had ever seen, over 30,000 troops, including professional redcoats, Hessian mercenaries from Germany, and a mighty fleet that darkened the harbors of New York. Their mission was clear: end the revolution before it could truly begin. In contrast, the Continental Army under George Washington was a shadow of its enemy, barely trained, poorly equipped, and lacking gunpowder, uniforms, and even shoes. These farmers and merchants faced the most disciplined army in the world. Yet Washington believed in something far stronger than weapons. He believed in the cause. Still, belief alone could not win battles. As summer unfolded, the British struck with overwhelming force. The Battle of Long Island became the first great test of the new nation's army, and it ended in disaster. Washington's troops were surrounded and outmatched. Many were captured or killed. The dream of freedom seemed to tremble under the weight of British might. But in the darkness of defeat, Washington revealed the quality that would define his leadership: calm perseverance. Under the cover of night and thick fog, he orchestrated a miraculous retreat across the East River, saving his army from annihilation. The Revolution would live to fight another day. Through the fall of 1776, the British swept through New York, forcing the Americans into retreat after retreat. The Redcoats occupied the city, raised their flag, and believed the rebellion was nearly crushed. Across the colonies, morale sank, soldiers deserted. Supplies ran thin. Winter loomed like a specter. By December, Washington's army had dwindled to a few thousand men, ragged, hungry, barefoot in the snow. The cause of liberty stood on the edge of collapse. Many believed the revolution was already over. But Washington refused to surrender. On Christmas night, 1776, in one of the boldest moves in military history, he made his stand. Crossing the icy Delaware River under blinding sleet and freezing winds, he led his men in silence toward the enemy camp at Trenton, New Jersey. At dawn, the Hessian soldiers awoke to thunder, not of storms, but of cannon fire. The surprise was total. Waiting unaware. The American flag flew over Trenton. Hundreds of enemy troops were captured. The victory electrified the colonies. It was a miracle of courage and timing, and proof that the revolution was far from over. A week later, Washington struck again at Princeton, defeating another British force and forcing them to retreat. For the first time, the world saw that the American army could win, not just survive. But even with these victories, the struggle was far from secure. The winter of 1777 brought hunger, sickness, and despair. Washington's army encamped at Morristown and later Valley Forge, where men endured frostbite, starvation, and disease. Many had no boots. Some wrapped their feet in rags. Blood marked the snow with every step. Washington wrote, To see men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lay on, and without shoes, marching through frost and snow, is a sight that must fill every heart with pain. Yet from that suffering was born resilience. Under the training of Baron von St, a Prussian officer who volunteered to help the Americans, the ragtag army transformed into a disciplined fighting force. Von Steuben drilled the men tirelessly, teaching them the precision of European warfare and giving them confidence that they could face the redcoats as equals. While Washington held the line, other battles raged across the colonies. In the North, the British launched an ambitious plan to divide America into a campaign that would change everything. General John Burgoyne marched south from Canada with a massive army, intending to seize the Hudson River and cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. But American resistance was fierce. Local militias hardened by the forests and hills ambushed and harassed the British supply lines. By the time Burgoyne reached Saratoga in the autumn of 1777, his army was exhausted and surrounded. In two brutal battles, American forces under General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold forced Burgoyne to surrender his entire army. It was a turning point, the first major victory for the United States. The world took notice. Across the Atlantic, the French watched closely. For years, France had thirsted for revenge against Britain after losing their colonies in the 7 Years' War. But they would not back a lost cause. Saratoga changed that. In 1778, France officially recognized the United States and entered the war as its ally, bringing ships, soldiers, and gold. The revolution was no longer just an American rebellion. It had become a global war. For Washington, the French alliance was a lifeline. Supplies improved, morale lifted, and hope returned. Yet the war's brutality did not fade. The British turned their focus to the south, hoping to rally loyalists and crush the rebellion region by region. Towns burned. Families were torn apart. In the Carolinas, the fighting became savage. A war of neighbor against neighbor, loyalty against liberty. Leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, waged guerrilla warfare, striking swiftly and vanishing into the marshes. Each small victory carried a heavy cost. But the spirit of resistance only grew stronger. By 1780, the war had stretched for 5 long years. The land was scarred. The people were weary. The dream of freedom burned brightly, but the path toward it remained uncertain. The Continental Congress struggled to fund the war. Inflation soared. Soldiers went unpaid. Farmers lost crops to both armies. Yet still, the people endured. They had begun the fight for liberty, and now they could not imagine life without it. Meanwhile, betrayal struck at the heart of the revolution. Benedict Arnold, once a hero of Saratoga, turned traitor. Tempted by money and promises of power, he plotted to hand over the American fort at West Point to the British. The plan was discovered in time, but the shock rippled through the colonies. Even so, Washington's resolve did not waver. He knew the revolution was more than battles and borders. It was about proving that freedom itself could survive against tyranny. As the war entered its final years, one truth became clear. The United States had been forged not just in fire, but the struggle was far from over. Yet every trial, every sacrifice was shaping the identity of a new nation. The British still held strongholds in the South. The war was spreading to Virginia, and as 1781 dawned, the final chapter of the Revolution began to unfold, one that would decide the fate of America forever. By 1781, the war had raged for nearly 6 relentless years. The land was weary. The people were battered, and yet the dream endured. The 13 colonies, once bound by fear and uncertainty, now stood united by one sacred conviction: freedom or death. But the cost had been staggering. Cethea's burned families divided, and thousands lay buried in unmarked fields. Still, the American cause lived on, carried not by wealth or power, but by an unyielding belief that a people could govern themselves. The British shift south. After years of stalemate in the north, the British strategy turned southward. They believed the southern colonies, with their plantations, wealth, and loyalist sympathies, would welcome the king's protection. In 1780, the British captured Charleston, South Carolina, one of the greatest American defeats of the war. Thousands of patriots were taken prisoner. The British General Charles Cornwallis, confident in his success, pushed inland to crush any remaining resistance. But he underestimated the spirit of the South. The Carolinas erupted into guerrilla warfare. Small bands of patriots, farmers, hunters, and frontiersmen fought in the shadows of the swamps and forests. They struck like ghosts and vanished before the British could strike back. Among them was Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox. His hit-and-run attacks frustrated Cornwallis's army and inspired countless others to rise. Alongside him were leaders like Thomas Sumter, the Fighting Gamecock, and Daniel Morgan, whose tactical brilliance would soon change the course of the war. At the Battle of Coupens in January 1781, Morgan executed a pretending to retreat. His militia lured the British into a trap. As they advanced, the Continental Army struck from concealment, annihilating one of Cornwallis's best units. The victory at Coupens electrified the colonies. It proved that strategy, not numbers, could win the day. A nation on the brink, but even as the war turned, the struggle for survival deepened. The Continental Congress was bankrupt. Paper money had become worthless. Soldiers went unpaid for months, sometimes years. Desperation ran high, and loyalty wavered. In the winter camps, the men spoke in whispers of rebellion, not against the British, but against their own leaders. Washington knew that discipline was slipping away. Yet, through quiet strength and solemn resolve, he held his army together. He reminded them that they were not fighting for Congress, but for the very idea of America. A nation that had yet to be born, but one worth every hardship. And somewhere in the midst of despair, hope flickered once more. The French alliance, forged after Saratoga, began to bear fruit. Ships from France crossed the Atlantic carrying supplies, soldiers, and most importantly, a new commander, General Jean-Baptiste de Rochambeau. By the summer of 1781, Rochambeau joined Washington in the north. Together, they plotted the final blow against the British Empire. The trap at Yorktown, meanwhile, in the south, Cornwallis made a fateful decision. After months of chasing American forces through the Carolinas, he moved his army north into Virginia, hoping to establish a secure base at Yorktown, a small port town on the Chesapeake Bay. There, he believed the British Navy would protect him and supply his troops. It was a fatal miscalculation. Washington and Rochambeau saw an opportunity. If they could trap Cornwallis at Yorktown, they could end the war in one decisive stroke. In a masterful deception, Washington kept his true plan secret, even from his own men. He appeared to prepare for an attack on New York City, but then, under cover of night, he led his army south, marching au bare 400 miles in complete secrecy. At the same time, a powerful French fleet, under Admiral de Grasse, sailed north from the Caribbean. On September 5, 1781, the British Navy tried to break through, but at the Battle of the Chesapeake, the French triumphed. The British fleet was forced to retreat to New York. Yorktown was now completely cut off. By late September, nearly 17,000 American and French troops surrounded Cornwallis's 8,000 soldiers. The siege began. Cannon fire thundered day and night. Earthworks closed in. The British defenses crumbled under relentless bombardment. Washington, ever the stoic commander, personally oversaw the positioning of artillery. The trenches crept closer each night, inch by inch, until the enemy's walls were within range of musket fire. In early October, the Allies launched a daring nighttime assault to capture two key British redoubts. Among the attackers was a young French nobleman who had become one of America's greatest allies, the Marquis de... Under cover of darkness, bayonets gleamed. The fighting was brutal, hand to hand, but swift. Within minutes, both redoubts fell. The Allied army's cannons now faced directly into the heart of Yorktown. For days, the British endured a storm of iron and fire. Their camps were torn apart, their men exhausted. Finally, on October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The war, for all practical purposes, was over. The surrender as the British troops marched out of Yorktown, their drums beat the tune, the world turned upside down. And indeed, it had. The mightiest empire on earth had been humbled by farmers, blacksmiths, and dreamers, men who believed that liberty was worth more than life itself. When news of the victory reached Philadelphia, church bells rang across the city. In Boston, crowds filled the streets, shouting with joy. Across the ocean, in London, shock and disbelief spread through Parliament. The British still held New York, Savannah, and Charleston. But the will to fight was broken. The war had dragged on too long, cost too much, and gained too little. Negotiations began. Peace and the Price of Freedom in 1783. After nearly 8 years of war, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States of America. The borders stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River, a vast new nation born out of blood and defiance. George Washington returned home to Mount Vernon, weary but victorious. When the war ended, he did something almost unheard of in history. He gave up power. He resigned his commission and returned to private life, saying, "Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action." The world watched in awe. Washington had not fought for a crown, nor for riches, but for principle, and that principle was now the foundation of a new republic. The revolution had ended, but the work of freedom had only begun. 13 colonies had become one nation. A people who once called themselves British now called themselves Americans. They had no king, no empire, only a fragile hope that liberty could last. But the fire that forged them in war would continue to burn in peace. The old war had done more than win independence. It had changed the course of human history. It proved that ordinary people, united by purpose, could rise against tyranny and prevail. From that moment on, the world would never be the same. The guns had fallen silent. The smoke of war drifted away into history, and out of the ashes of revolution, a new nation stood, fragile, wounded, but alive. It was 1783. After 8 years of struggle, the United States of America was finally free. But independence was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The war had united the colonies against a common enemy. But now, with victory achieved, that unity began to crack. The 13 states were bound by little more than hope and exhaustion. There was no strong central government, no real army, no reliable currency. The dream of liberty was alive, but the reality of nationhood was uncertain. The struggle after victory under the Articles of Confederation, adopted during the war, the new Congress had limited power. It could not collect taxes, regulate trade, or even enforce its own laws. Each state acted like its own small country, issuing money, managing militias, and guarding its independence. To many, it seemed the revolution had replaced one tyranny with 13 separate ones. The soldiers who had fought so bravely returned home to find no pay, little recognition, and ruined farms. The treasury was empty. Inflation was rampant. The war had been won on courage, but courage could not feed a nation. In the countryside of Massachusetts, discontent turned to revolt. In 1786, former soldiers and farmers, led by Daniel Shays, rose in rebellion against high taxes and debt. The uprising shocked the young republic. For a moment, it seemed that the nation born in freedom might die in chaos. From Virginia to New York, leaders realized that liberty alone was not enough. Freedom needed structure. Independence needed order. The time had come to build a government worthy of the revolution that had created it. The Constitutional Convention in the spring of 1787, delegates from across the states gathered in Philadelphia, the same city where independence had been declared 11 years earlier. The air was thick with debate and expectation. Inside the State House, 55 men, among them George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, set out to rebuild the nation from the ground up. Washington, revered as a hero, was chosen to preside over the convention. His presence alone brought unity to the room. Franklin, old and wise, urged compromise. Madison, the quiet scholar, became the architect of a new vision. They met in secrecy. The windows were shut, the doors guarded. The task before them was nothing less than revolutionary: to create a system of government, not based on kings or empires, but on the will of the people. Weeks turned into months. Tempers flared, alliances shifted, and the debates raged over power, representation, and freedom. Should large states dominate small ones? Should the government be strong or weak? How could liberty survive authority? At last, a new framework began to take shape, one that balanced power between the states and the nation, between the people and their leaders. The result was the United States Constitution, a document unlike any in history. It established a republic where power came not from birthright or bloodline, but from the consent of the governed. It created 3 branches, executive, legislative, and judicial, to ensure that no one man could ever again wield the power of a king. It declared, in its preamble, a promise to generations yet unborn. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. When the Constitution was signed in September 1787, Franklin, then 81 years old, was asked what kind of government they had created. He replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." The first president, the new government, needed a leader, someone trusted, respected, and beyond ambition. There was only one choice. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. When he took the oath of office in New York City, standing beneath a clear April sky, he placed his hand on the Bible and whispered the words that would echo through time, "So help me God." For the people, it was a moment of awe. The general who had led them through war was now the president who would lead them through peace. But Washington faced immense challenges. The nation was divided by regional loyalties, burdened by debt, and uncertain of its place in the world. There was no guarantee the new republic would survive. With patience and humility, Washington set the standard for leadership. He refused royal titles. He lived simply. He listened. He believed that power must always serve the people, never rule them. He formed a cabinet of brilliant minds. Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. Their rival visions would define America's political life. Jefferson's belief in liberty and agriculture versus Hamilton's dream of industry and centralized strength. Through compromise and courage, Washington stabilized the young nation. He founded a national bank, established the Bill of Rights, and set the precedent of stepping down after 2 terms, ensuring that no president would ever become a king. When he finally retired, the people wept. Washington had given the nation 2 great gifts: independence and restraint. A new identity, the America of the 1790s, was still small and fragile. Its borders stretched only to the Mississippi. Its cities were few, its roads unpaved, its navy almost non-existent. But the idea, the dream, was powerful. Immigrants from across the world began to arrive, drawn by the promise of a land where a man's worth was not measured by his birth, but by his work. The old war had taught the people the price of freedom. Now they would learn the meaning of artists, thinkers, and writers began to shape a national identity. Schools spread knowledge. The Constitution became the nation. It's a sacred text, a living promise that freedom could be protected by law. But shadows still lingered. The Revolution had declared that all men are created equal, yet slavery still bound hundreds of thousands in chains. Native nations, too, watched with sorrow as their lands were claimed in the name of progress. The ideals of liberty were pure, but the reality of equality was incomplete. Still, the fire of revolution burned on, now in hearts, not on battlefields. The people believed that with time, America could grow into the dream it had declared. The legacy of the old war. By the dawn of the 19th century, America was no longer a fragile experiment. It was a nation young, ambitious, and restless. The Revolution had not only freed a people, it had changed the course of the world. It inspired movements in France, in Latin America, and beyond. It proved that monarchy was not destiny, that ordinary men could rise up and shape their own fate. The old war, as generations would call it, was not just a military victory. It was a moral triumph. It proved that courage, unity, and belief could defy empires. George Washington passed away in 1799, leaving behind a nation still finding its way. His death was mourned from farmhouses to foreign courts. Kings who once dismissed him now bowed in respect. As Thomas Jefferson later said, the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. The old war had been that first sacrifice, the price of a new beginning. The fires that once burned across Lexington, Saratoga, and Yorktown had gone out, but the spirit that lit them lived on. In every town square, in every classroom, in every voice that spoke freely, the revolution endured. It was not just history. It was a promise that freedom, once fought for, must always be defended. And so, America began its long, uncertain journey from a cluster of rebellious colonies to a beacon for the world. The revolution had ended. The Constitution had been written. The first president had stepped down. But the true test of the new nation had only just begun. The war that had forged America in fire had done more than break chains. It had unleashed an idea so powerful that it could not be contained by borders or time, that all men are created equal, that liberty is the right of every human being, that governments exist not to rule the people, but to serve them. These words, once whispered in rebellion, became the foundation of a new kind of world. The early decades of the United States were filled with triumph and turmoil. The 1800s brought both promise and peril. New territories opened to the west. The Mississippi, the Great Plains, the Rockies, all called to settlers hungry for freedom and land. But with expansion came conflict. Native nations were pushed aside, their lands taken in the name of destiny. The same republic that had fought against empire now became one. Still, the dream of liberty marched onward, imperfect, yet unstoppable. In 1801, Thomas Jefferson became president, marking the first peaceful transfer of power between rivals, proof that democracy could survive without violence. Under Jefferson's vision, the young nation doubled in size with the Louisiana Purchase, opening vast lands for exploration. Lewis and Clark journeyed westward, mapping the unknown, and discovering the true scope of the continent. The revolution had won. America was growing fast, fearless, and flawed. But beneath its success, a storm was forming. The contradiction at the heart of the revolution, freedom for some, bondage for others, was tearing at the nation's soul. The founders had declared liberty universal, yet slavery still thrived in the South. The words of 1776, "All men are created equal," echoed louder with each passing generation, demanding to be fulfilled. By the mid-19th century, the ideals of the old war returned to haunt America. When Abraham Lincoln rose to power, he invoked the same vision that Jefferson and Washington had fought for, a nation where freedom belonged to all. The Civil War, though fought many years later, was in many ways the second act of the Revolution, a battle to decide whether the promises made in Philadelphia would truly apply to every man and woman. And when Lincoln stood at Gettysburg and said that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, he was speaking the same truth that had been born in the flames of 1776. The old war-esque spirit lived on in every cry for justice, every stand against tyranny, every soul who dared to dream of equality. As centuries turned, the legacy of America's founding burned brighter. From Europe to Asia, from Africa to the Middle East, the example of the United States inspired nations to rise. The idea that ordinary people could govern themselves, once considered madness, became the model for the modern world. And yet, America's journey was never perfect. Every generation faced its own trials, wars, divisions, struggles for civil rights, and battles against injustice. But each time the nation stumbled, it looked back to the same beginning, to Lexington and to Independence Hall, to the men and women who risked everything for an impossible dream. That dream became its compass. Through the blood of the Revolution, through the fires of the Civil War, through the storms of 2 world wars, and the tensions of the Cold War, one belief remained unbroken, that freedom is worth fighting for. The title of this story, How America Was Forged in Fire, was never a metaphor alone. The Revolution was not only a battle against Britain, it was a test of identity, of endurance, of soul. Every musket fired, every letter written, every life sacrificed. They were hammer strikes against the iron of history. The fire of war shaped America's character, its resilience, born at Valley Forge, its courage, tested at Yorktown, its unity, carved out of difference. And from that fire came something eternal, a belief that liberty, once kindled, can light the world. It is the same fire that burns in the torch of the Statue of Liberty, that shines in the Capitol dome, that glows in the hearts of those who still believe that freedom has no master. Today, the echoes of the old war still whisper across America, in its fields, its cities, its classrooms, and its people. Every generation inherits the same question the founders once faced. Can freedom endure? The Revolution's legacy is not in monuments or museums, but in responsibility, the duty of every citizen to protect what was earned through sacrifice. The old war gave birth to a nation, but it is the people who must keep that nation alive. Freedom, after all, is not a gift. It is a fire, one that must be tended, defended, and passed on. When the founders signed their names to the Declaration of Independence, they did so knowing they might die for it. Yet they signed anyway, because they believed that some things are worth dying for, and that belief became the heartbeat of America. 250 years later, the world has changed beyond recognition. Empires have fallen, borders have shifted, but the light that was born in that small room in Philadelphia still burns. The old war, the war that forged America in fire, remains not just a chapter of history, but a living flame. It reminds humanity that freedom, once awakened, never sleeps, that the courage of a few can inspire the hope of millions, and that from the ashes of oppression, the human spirit can rise again and again. So long as liberty lives, the story of that war lives too. The muskets may have fallen silent, the soldiers long returned to dust, but their dream, the dream of a world where every man, woman, and child can live free, endures. That is the legacy of the old war. That is how America was forged in fire.